Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm LELDF President Jason Johnson, joined by my co-host and LELDF Director of Policy, Sean Kennedy. We are wrapping up our first season of this podcast.
I mean, I thought it was a great mixture of all the things LELDF does and what matters about our work, and really what matters about the criminal justice system and policing in America, from facts about policing and false narratives about what goes on in law enforcement that are being perpetuated by the media. We talked about specific, very compelling cases that LELDF is working on and injustices being done to officers in courts of law. And we talked to law enforcement and policy leaders who day to day are in the trenches, both researching and doing the job of making us safe in communities. We talked to a sheriff in Loudoun County, one of the largest counties in America. We talked to a prosecutor outside of Chicago. We spoke to some of the foremost policy experts on policing-related issues. And we talked to cops themselves, cops who were prosecuted. And when you look at those cases, you have to think to yourself, there are real-life consequences for both officers and their families and the public at large and the health of the American criminal justice system. You've been intimately involved with the officers themselves and their families and their lawyers, including Dennis Spaulding in East Haven, Connecticut, and officers outside of Austin, Texas, with their lawyer, Doug O'Connell, who we had on the podcast, and of course, Mark Wagner out of Wisconsin, who's a special agent with the Department of Justice there. What is your real takeaway from those three cases?
I think rush to judgment is the biggest thing. We see that in cases, a lot of LELDF cases, actually. I think the reason for that is that there's a lot of pressure on prosecutors, especially post 2015, 2020, whatever year you look at, where some of these prosecutors were elected with what they ran on was, I will hold police accountable. So they're constantly looking for cases in which they can bring charges against a law enforcement officer. And I think that there's no better example of that than Jose Garza in Travis County, Texas. I mean, there are others that may try to rival him, but I think that's really kind of his signature move, is to look for cops to charge. And there's you didn't have that 20 or 30 years ago. You certainly had cases in which law enforcement officers were charged with crimes related to their work, but my sense is that was normally done by prosecutors who thought they were doing the right thing. In some cases they were. Some cases they were doing the right thing. There are cases, obviously, where charging a cop is the right thing, and it is what prosecutors should do. But now we're seeing it almost as a vanity. It's a way of becoming closer with elements of these communities that think that's what they should be doing. So they bring bogus cases. Sometimes they're just doomed from the outset. So even prosecutors that are more even-handed and aren't necessarily looking to charge cops, there happens to be a case that is just so high profile, and maybe there's a video clip that hits the community a certain way, and that results in prosecutors going after the cops. So it happens for a lot of different reasons. It's happening now more than ever. I mean, and that's evidenced by our caseload here at LELDF. So it's not something that was a fad. Unfortunately, we were showing how we got here, media narratives and the political narratives and things that kind of got us to this point where there's not only unfair treatment of individual officers, which is, of course, very important to us here at LELDF, but also policies that have been implemented that are really harmful to public safety. We told how it happened or why it happened, and then what the impact has been, all at the same time.
I mean, I think the way to think about it in this respect is the burden of proof has been flipped. That for officers walking into the courtroom, they are guilty before being proved innocent. And in the broader sense, good policing tactics, tried and true and effective policy, is wrong before it's proven right. We should prosecute more criminals, longer jail sentences, cops should be proactive. No, these are wrong because X, Y, and Z. And then they undo them, as we saw both after 2015 and then again in 2020, and bad things happen. And there were no consequences for undoing good and effective policing and good, effective prosecution because, we just tried something. We just experimented. It's okay. Yeah. We just prosecuted this cop. So the burden of proof had been flipped until you completely vindicate and exonerate an officer in a court of law. They are perceived by these activists, both activists on the street and the activists who hold prosecutors' jobs, to be guilty. It started with media myths and narratives that have been pushed, by academics and by activists and whatnot, which sort of percolated through society and through public perceptions. And we talked about how the public just totally misunderstands how much police violence, as they say, goes on, how much of this is somehow racially disparate, and what is actually happening on the streets. They totally misperceive all of these things in the public, and the polling bears that out. And that has this distortionary effect on policymakers. And so many policymakers either are feeding into that and want to win elective office based on this misperception, or feel pressure. Like you said, there's good prosecutors out there who feel like the world will come down on them if they don't charge a cop, if they do something that may be tough but is the right thing to do. And the consequences are real. People like Dennis Spaulding go to jail and spend years away from their family because of what is effectively a political prosecution.
So the narrative versus the facts, there's polling that shows that people, average normal Americans, think like 10,000 unarmed Black Americans were shot by the police in a given year. And like how far from the truth that really is.
It was 18.
Right. It's like, yeah,
they
it's not just
mostly
wrong.
Unarmed. Yeah.
It's not just wrong. It's wrong by so many orders of magnitude that we're not even on the same planet. And I mean, we've seen the surveys that people have taken. And then we looked at the real number, and it's from thousands down to 18. Well, it's no wonder why Congress going to ram some police reform bill through. Many states did the same thing. Those things have real impacts, but it's all based on a false premise.
And that false premise obviously has consequences. There's tons of psychological studies about this. When the media is particularly vulnerable to this effect, which is when a story comes out and says the sky is purple, it's the front page of the New York Times, and you ask people 2 weeks later, because they retracted that, it turns out the sky's not purple.
In a little footnote.
But it's a footnote
5.
at the end. They just remember the first impression. They will not unring the narrative. Just people who lived through the 80s and 90s, are eggs bad or good for you? It depends on what day you saw the study.
Sure.
And so we're in the same boat right now, which the truth of the number of unarmed individuals shot by police can be counted in the dozens every year. And most of them weren't actually non-threats. If they were unarmed, they were still driving at the cops with a car or they were drawing something. Somebody was pointing finger guns at a cop that was one of the unarmed people after popping out behind a wall. That's not a good idea.
Yeah.
Not a good idea.
Not to be recommended.
And so the cop shot an unarmed man who pretended to have a gun and tried to surprise the cops. So that's an unarmed individual. And this media narrative that there's so many people killed and all these incidents are happening just isn't true. But you can't tell people otherwise because they will not believe it.
Yeah. It's like, no, we're just talking facts here. That's all we want to do is we want to compare what you think is true because of what the media or whatever that you've been exposed to versus what actually is true, which come from complete nonpartisan sources. Like we're not talking about
sources that are obviously biased against
us.
The Washington Post is
definitely not a source we would choose, but that's a source we have. And it confirms what we say.
The study we did about police shootings particularly comes from the Washington Post. If you read the Washington Post introduction to their data set, it makes the point in broad outlines that there is this mass epidemic of police shootings. But of course, their data set doesn't support that. But they put up a bunch of fancy bar graphs that supposedly show that about racial disparities or whatever. Of course, they're totally mischaracterizing what their data actually shows. But we're using their data. And so it's not like we just cooked it up, but they are trying to present it in one way. And that's not what the data shows.
When anyone is trying to make a point about policing and race, they often point to disparities that are completely sterile. If you spread the Black American population throughout the country, it's like roughly 13%. But you have to look at it in a completely different way of like, okay, well, that's fine. But if the population of a city that you're looking at is 50% Black, then we're not going to use the national 13%, right? That's not what should apply to that situation. I think that's the point, that it can be misleading if you don't understand that. If you're looking at any other data that has to do with traffic stops or person stops or whatever, if you want to draw any conclusions, you have to look at it on a much smaller scale. You can't look at it at the national population distribution.
And that actually works for this larger media narrative, is when you ask African Americans in general what they think about policing in the United States. There's a hostility amongst a certain segment or plurality or whatnot of that. But then you ask the same people, what do you think of your local police force?
They love them.
And 75% of African Americans, we love our police force.
They do community policing.
They do a great job.
Places.
It's those other bad cops. And it's like, well, there's a disconnect there. And that's the same thing here. Is nationally, there's a perception of police, but the cop on their street is actually a good guy. And so this sort of disembodied otherization of the cops is something that has led to these false prosecutions and led to these narratives. We spoke to 2 cops that were LELDF cases, Mark Wagner out of Wisconsin and Dennis Spaulding. And then we spoke to somebody else who's handled a number of these cases, including cases here with LELDF in Texas. Doug O'Connell.
Yeah, I mean, I think Doug, just because he practices in Travis County, which includes Austin, that he's mostly dealing with one prosecutor's office, and he also is like the go-to attorney, criminal defense lawyer for police in that area. So he is very aware, in a way that most people aren't, about every case that involves law enforcement officers that is being prosecuted or may be prosecuted. In one case involving Chance Breches, Doug is Chance's attorney. He has recently filed a motion. It's regarding a Brady issue, a failure of the prosecutor's office to disclose very important exculpatory information. They have a duty to do that. That he is really more aware than most people of the behind the scenes of what's going on. He's brought these motions before. He just is more in touch with sort of the day to day of what's happening with prosecuting cops. And I mean, as I said before, and as we even mentioned during the episode, that Travis County is ground zero for prosecuting cops without evidence. And Doug just is so
Who
plugged
needs
into
evidence?
that. Yeah, he's just so plugged into that. He just is aware in a way that I think, unfortunately, most people are, which I wish the greater Travis County community was more aware of what was going on there. It's something we work hard to try to bring more attention to. Some prosecutors are looking for communities where they might be able to prosecute a cop. And Jose Garza's done that. And I think he's done it 27 times, Sean. And when we talked to Doug O'Connell about it, is zero conviction. So it's like he's willing to just bring a case to show he's trying.
It's performative.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he thinks he's going to win and he keeps losing. He's just not very good at it.
Yeah. He's waiting for he's hoping there will be a time that it'll work out for him. It just
One
hasn't
day.
yet. Yeah.
One day. Well, and not only did we talk directly to officers and Doug, an attorney for officers in cases we handle, but we talked to a number of law enforcement leaders, including Sheriff Mike Chapman in Loudoun County, Patrick Kenneally out of McHenry County, which is outside of Chicago, who's a prosecutor there, who just retired. Bob Scales, who was the assistant city attorney in Seattle, who handled consent decrees. And as we said, Ralph Manguel at the Manhattan Institute, who's an expert on criminal justice policy in general. Sheriff Chapman wanted to get school resource officers into the schools, real uniformed police, armed officers into the schools. And the very liberal board there rejected that after we spoke to Mike Chapman. And just last week, an individual was plotting to kill children at a high school in Loudoun County. So if that had come to fruition, it's sometimes the lack of foresight that you see from these people because they hate the cops. And that's what Sheriff Chapman said is they're not anti-school security. They're anti-police. And this idea of policing is anathema to them. And there could be, in this case, in Loudoun County specifically, there could have been a consequence if his office hadn't caught this kid.
This issue around schools, particularly around school resource officers, that it was never an issue before. I mean, my entire law enforcement career, I mean, in the early 2000s, I think, is when the school resource officer programs kicked off in a lot of jurisdictions. Some of them before that. The idea was never to create school security around school resource officers. It was that's part of it. Obviously, you have an armed, trained, sworn law enforcement officer in the schools because of the school. But the idea was that school resource officers would be a way of catching young people early enough that they could show the human side of law enforcement. And it would actually build relationships because for a lot of young people, they've never interacted with law enforcement before. They just see law enforcement officers as some institution that they have never formed any relationship with. And so by putting a real live police officer or sheriff's deputy in a school, the idea was you can build those relationships. Doesn't that sound like a good idea, Sean? It sounds like a good idea to me.
Not if you don't want them to. That's the point. They don't want them to have a positive relationship.
We're constantly
with
talking about how, like, you know, the activists, anti-law enforcement activists are constantly complaining about law enforcement agencies don't do enough to build. This is what they refer to community policing in the abstract, like it doesn't have actual meaning. One of the meanings it has, if it has any meaning, is that it's important to have relationships so that individual law enforcement officers get to know people in their communities and vice versa, right? They get to know each other. It helps both sides because law enforcement officers also can benefit from knowing the humanity of the people that they serve. But it's equally true the other way. But if you add on to that, the very legitimate observation that it's also additional security. The idea is not for school resource officers to start arresting young people in the schools. They barely ever do that. But yet these mostly suburban communities who have been overly influenced, I think, by the old suburban white woman political thing of like, let's adopt the political concerns of what we perceive as being in the best interest of minorities, I think is kind of how it goes. And they impose these policies that actually hurt everyone, including anti-school resource officer policies. And this has happened particularly since 2020 about this half-baked idea that we can't trust law enforcement and young people shouldn't be near them. And it's, to me, it's just insane.
I see this every time there's like an incident at one of these high schools where a kid brings a gun or a knife or there's a fight and there's a weapon involved or whatever. And the school comes in with the magnetometers, the metal detectors, and they interview somebody who's for it and then somebody who's against it, some parent or whatever. And I don't know why, but it's 9 out of 10 times whoever's opposed to it doesn't have a kid at that school. Because every single parent who's like, somebody brought a gun to school?
I just want to protect my kid.
Pat the kid down. Strip search them. Nobody's bringing a gun into my school again. No one's getting stabbed. My children's safety is important to me. And then they get some outside activist who's outside the school going no to this or is at the school board meeting. In a lot of these places where this is a threat, the parents are overwhelmingly in support of making sure every kid is safe and there's no weapons on campus. Because if it doesn't affect you, then you get to search you signal about it. And that's the whole, that's kind of the bigger picture here, is that so much of this is virtue signaling. The people who don't have to live with the consequences of their policies like to push them. The consequences are real. I mean, first, we get bad policies in the case of both these prosecutors and some of this, depolicing effect that we saw after Floyd, particularly, and the crime and violence that followed. And then on the personal level, not that crime isn't very personal, but in the aggregate, we talk about murder numbers, whatever, there are real victims there. But there are these officers who get prosecuted and their lives destroyed to fit a political agenda. And it's a rush to judgment that ruins lives and honestly a rush to a policy judgment that costs lives.
And I mean, it's also just a vicious cycle because sometimes the way the news coverage of these officer cases plays out is even when the case ends in an acquittal of the officer gets cleared, which vast majority of our LELDF cases, ultimately the officer's cleared. The news coverage actually reinforces the belief that there is a problem in law enforcement. We've never denied that there are cases where a law enforcement officer went over the line and should be prosecuted. And nevertheless, the coverage itself actually feeds the narrative and reinforces that even if the officer got found not guilty, there will be some angle to it. There'll be some like, well, the officer was acquitted, but they chose a bench trial and it was a judge who decided they weren't guilty, not 12 citizens.
And that judge's second cousin's third wife was a police officer, so they're biased.
Or the prosecution kind of messed it up, or the investigation was too biased because the police were investigating themselves. It's never just, hey, maybe they just got this one wrong. Maybe we should be more careful about who we choose to prosecute because we actually should look at the evidence.
I mean, George Gascon in L.A., he reopened a bunch of cases, and we actually had one of those cases out of Torrance, California, in Los Angeles. And there was another case north of L.A. that Gascon had. And distinctly remember when he reopened the case that had been cleared by the prior DA, been cleared by the police, been cleared by everybody. The LA Times said this officer had killed this person implicitly, unjustifiably. Mm-hmm. But then the original story, when the initial shooting happened, the LA Times mentioned the guy pointed a gun at the cops. But in the subsequent story, when Gascon reopened the case, that fact was omitted.
So two out of 3 LA County prosecutors, 2 out of the last 3 have found that this absolutely is a case that should not be charged. It was only the prosecutor who ran on it,
Yeah, he literally was like his political campaign was and send the cops to jail.
Yeah, and all 3 are Democrats, right? Of the 3, so Jackie Lacey and then George Gascon and now Nathan Hochman, all 3 Democrats. Nathan Hochman hasn't been in office long enough, I think, for us to really say, but Jackie Lacey was not perceived as like in the bag for the cops. Like she was not thought of as a cop defender necessarily, right?
Most big city Democratic prosecutors are prosecutors, and they prosecute cops.
And they do prosecute cops
and they prosecute
pretty
cops
routinely, right?
Yeah. But it's a question of when they make a judgment call, they feel like they have to have the evidence behind it. And sometimes it's show me the man and I'll show you the crime. And that's exactly what the people of George Gascon's ilk have sought is, you're wearing a badge, you must have done something wrong. Mm-hmm. And even if they are personally motivated by a much more deep-seated animus, they are abetted by these public myths because now the public thinks, oh, well, they must have something to that. Clearly, I've heard the cops shoot a lot of people, so that it's totally reasonable.
I think it's like 10,000 unarmed people, Sean. Isn't that right?
It's like a football stadium of people.
Right.
The cops are just blasting away. But that sort of myth is insidious and not only ruins lives, but you made a point that I think was very important. What does that do when you put out these myths to officer-subject interactions? Because you talked about a tragic incident that actually was.
Yeah, it does. I mean,
it
and I've been saying this for a while, and like most things I say, people don't listen that much, but it actually creates an increased possibility that any interaction, once you have caused a sufficient number of people to distrust the police, notwithstanding the objective evidence, that when they get approached by a law enforcement officer, particularly, I mean, I think this is particularly true in the minority community only because they have been fed this narrative like nonstop that like you can't trust the cops. They're just out. They just want to kill you. That you will fight for your life rather than get arrested because you believe that you're being arrested is going to like something, you're going to be killed or something because you've been told this. And that actually can be a self-fulfilling prophecy because once you start resisting and trying to take cops' tasers and guns and things, there could be a bad outcome. And we had a case we were involved in a few years ago in Atlanta that I think bore that out pretty well. It was a guy who had told his family, this is in 2020, this was like on the wake of George Floyd. There were literally riots in Atlanta at the time.
It was a couple of weeks,
later, it was like right then. If you imagine yourself, you kind of put yourself in the shoes of a man who happened to be a black man. He had no criminal history, really, I mean, to speak of at all. But he had expressed to family members how fearful he was about interactions with the police because of all these, mostly the singular story out of Minneapolis, the George Floyd. And he had told family members this. He was out at I think it was a Wendy's.
Yeah, it was a Wendy's parking lot.
And he was like in a drive-through and he fell asleep. He had been drinking. And he was approached by Atlanta police officers who quite rightly and justifiably were going to make an arrest for driving while intoxicated. And there's no reason in the world to think that he was really that afraid of being arrested. There's every reason in the world to think that he thought being arrested was going to result in him being brutalized or killed because he had been told that he should be afraid of that. And as a response, he took an officer's taser and attempted to use it on an officer, which resulted in deadly force being used, which is justifiable, I mean, in those circumstances. But yet, it's like, so the bottom line of the story, as we could go on forever, is that I do believe that these fake narratives actually cost that man his life because I don't think he would have reacted that way if he felt he was just going to be given a breathalyzer test, written some traffic tickets, and released, which is what was going to happen.
Yeah, he would have been home within 12 hours, and
12, probably within 2.
Yeah, and his car would have been, they would have fined to get it out of the impound. But he was literally blocking the Wendy's drive-through, and it was obviously dangerous on the roads.
Sure.
And so the cops had a legitimate purpose and probable cause to stop him.
And
he had so worked himself up that he thought any encounter with the police was going to cost him his life. It actually did cost him his life. It's something I think some of the people who perpetuate these myths don't understand.
Yeah, you're actually hurting people.
You're hurting the people you think you're defending. And that's what we want to do here on this podcast. And that is to continue to dispel these myths, to continue to bring you both newsmakers and law enforcement leaders and specific law enforcement officers who've been affected by some of these prosecutions to bring about what the truth about policing is, what really goes on sort of behind the scenes in courtrooms and in law enforcement back offices, and what happens in these courtrooms and what happens to the lives of officers who sometimes, get in the crosshairs of people who are out to prosecute cops. So
on the one other consequence we've talked today, kind of summarizing the season, is a misunderstanding of reality, understanding the media narrative as being true, which it isn't, and we try to show that through data. That results in bad policy like consent decrees and other things that we've covered this season. Can't have school resource officers in schools because of these poor perceptions. State laws really constraining law enforcement authority because of this fake narrative, if you will, or misleading narrative anyway. Bad prosecutions of cops and all that. But then the one thing that's kind of missing out of that was our very last guest of the season, which was Rob Quick, who's vice president and COO of Harbor of Grace, which is a treatment center / recovery center. They treat first responders with not only substance use disorder, but like a whole range of things: post-traumatic stress, grief from loss, burnout, professional burnout, and things like that. Just these are the unspoken things. And I say unspoken because within first responder circles, it's not unspoken anymore. But I think the larger community doesn't necessarily have a full understanding of the mental health, behavioral health consequences of a lot of these things. And Rob was fantastic. And I know Rob, he and I worked together at BPD. Fantastic. Just an excellent cop, first of all, and just a really good guy. And he himself started his relationship with Harbor of Grace as a patient in inpatient treatment, and then since then has begun working there and has been elevated through the ranks, so to speak. Who told us that, among other things, that this particular sort of battle in the war of cops, if you want to call it that, since 2015, 2020, depending on what part of the country you're thinking about, that this has really accelerated that in so many ways for cops who have suffered not only increased stress, which has always been part of the job, but a loss of professional esteem is the way I like to say it. Is becoming a law enforcement officer, at least in my day and in all previous generations, was thought of as a really net good for humanity. You're doing something good. You're helping people in a way, in many different ways, but it was considered something that was just, you are a leader in the community, if you want to look at it that way. And because of all this, we've led to a place where that is not always the case anymore. Sometimes you're thought of as being antithetical to what's good for the community, that you are a problem that needs to be eradicated. And so I think we rounded out the season by pointing out that one thing that I think many people just aren't focused on, that increasingly inside the ranks of first responders, it is a focus. Fortunately, leaders now understand the importance of getting people help and supporting them along the way that hopefully can avoid the need for help later on.
I think so. I mean, I think one of the things we often talk about, the visible wounds of policing, obviously officers who are injured or killed, but there are invisible wounds, and there are so many more officers who suffer those. And sometimes it can end careers, it could end families, it could destroy a lot of things. And there are political consequences to so much of what we talked about, but there are personal consequences that are not seen, that Rob has to help heal. I think that really encapsulates our last season, and we're looking forward to coming back. We're planning our next season. If you have any feedback, tell us your favorite episode, your least favorite episode, something we didn't know about, something we talked about. You can email us at podcast@leldf.org. Thank you again for my co-host and LELDF President Jason Johnson. I'm Sean Kennedy, Director of Policy at the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, and we'll see you in a few months.